Okay, we're going to be working on the questions for chapter 16 and 17 in your Uncle Tom's Cabin book, and I do expect these to be filled in, but I will be helping you and talking about it, so don't panic. Okay, chapter 16, we kind of get to meet a little bit more of the new family that Uncle Tom has been purchased by. The father is Augustin St. Clair, and the mother is Marie. And I hope you've listened to this one. If you haven't, just go back and listen to a little bit of it. You really need to understand Marie, and I think listening to it is probably the best way to do that. I'm going to move this clipboard because that's going to be in my way in just a second. So the chapter opens with kind of them sitting around talking, and the new cousin is kind of getting her lay of the land, so we can kind of see things through her eyes a little bit. And Marie's talking about how cousin Ophelia, Miss Ophelia, is going to take things over. What does Marie say she's plagued with and why? Well, she complains that owning slaves is a terrible hardship. She has to work so hard to keep the slaves in line and to keep them doing what they ought to do, and they're just so tricky and lazy, and everything's just horrible. So for her, she's kind of plagued with owning slaves, and that the stress of that has caused her a lot of illness. And one of the specific things that she was complaining about, we'll get to down here, but her husband is sitting there listening to it, and of course he's heard this all before. Miss Ophelia doesn't quite know what to say, but St. Clair says selfishness is a dreadful fault. And I'm just going to write over here. You don't have to write it, but if you don't know what sarcasm is, I think you all do because I'm your teacher. But sarcasm is when, you say the opposite of what you mean, sort of. And so he was commenting on it as if he were being sympathetic to her, but he really wasn't sympathetic to her. He knew who was selfish and and what was really going on. So what had Marie done to Mammy? She had, she kept waking her up in the middle of the night because she needed help. If she was the least bit uncomfortable, she would ask Mammy to get her something, or fluff her pillows, or get her another blanket, or take the blanket off, I'm sure, just all through the night. And then scolding her. So kept waking Mammy, I should say, so you know. Scolding Mammy for being tired. And I'm not sure if we come across this yet. It also mentions that she had that Mammy had been her slave when she was not married yet, and when she got married and had to move, of course she had to take Mammy with her, and Mammy wouldn't stop fussing about her husband and missing her husband and her children, and Marie has absolutely no sympathy for her. It's hard to imagine that kind of mindset, but then we can just ask God to help us see our own selfishness, which is there all the time. But I'm not going to make you write all that down. But, poor Mammy really had a mistress in Marie that was probably very hard to take. Okay, vinaigrette. You probably think of it, if you know of it at all, it's like a salad dressing. It's like vinegar and oil and some seasonings and things. In this case, Marie was kind of using it as a smelling salt. That was something they used to do. Like if you felt faint, then you would kind of sniff a little something that had a strong smell and it would revive you. So it's just kind of plays into her languishing and her feeling like she's so overworked and it's so hard to own slaves and she's sick all the time and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Indulge. I'm just going to write allowing enjoyment. You can allow enjoyment in yourself or you can allow enjoyment in other people. I'm going to indulge you by giving you this day off, or I'm going to indulge my sweet tooth and eat a piece of cake. And Marie was complaining that, of course, she was complaining that St. Clair indulged all of his slaves, and she thinks that's abominable. It's causes revulsion. It just makes her sick how St. Clair treats his slaves. He gives them too much. He's too lenient with them. He doesn't whip them. So she's just disgusted by his behavior. What does Marie complain about? Oh my, list. You know, we'll just list a few things. She has terrible headaches. Trials of housekeeping. No one listens to her. So she thinks she never complains, but still she's upset because no one listens to her. And then again, what we mentioned about Mammy, so we could say just like ungrateful slaves. And if Mammy really loved her, she would easily wake up every hour of the night and be energetic all day. So Marie is just a real case. Okay. Tom is Eva's new playmate. What is their relationship like? What are some of the things that they enjoy doing together? So I would just, the word that came to my mind was they dote on each other. They just really seem to get along and connect. She decorates him with flowers. That's a scene in this. And in case you're wondering, you do need to write this down. I wrote that on the grid, and I think I mentioned it, but I want you to do this with me. She sits on his knee and talks to him all day. Okay, where did just the ladies go? To church. And you don't have to write all this down. I won't either. But this is a place where you get the understanding that St. Clair is very kind of cynical about church. And I think he may have reasons to be cynical because his argument is that they preach, they twist the verses in the Bible to say whatever they want. And so at this point in time, they like slavery, and so they twist the Bible to say slavery's wonderful, there's nothing wrong with it, you can do whatever you want with your slaves, And then he says if slavery became unprofitable, they'd probably just twist it the other way and say it's terrible to own slaves. So they're not really trying to understand what the Bible says. They're just doing what they want. Who is Tom praying for? I'm sorry, what is Tom praying for? St. Clair at the end of this chapter. He's praying for St. Clair's salvation. And that was kind of a sweet time because Uncle Tom didn't even know that St. Clair was there and wasn't particularly polite, I guess you could say. St. Clair thought, he wasn't holding back. He was letting God know that he felt like St. Clair needed to be saved. So, okay, I'm going to answer this question first. Who is St. Clair talking about in this quote? He's talking about his cousin, Miss Ophelia. She came from the north, And she's very strongly opposed to slavery. She does not like slavery at all. She thinks it's horrible and barbaric and it should be abolished. However, she's also repulsed by Eva sitting in Uncle Tom's lap and talking to him and touching him. So she kind of has an interesting perspective that we'll get to see more of how that develops as the story goes on. But this quote is St. Clair actually talking about her. And he says them, that would be the slaves who are black. You loathe them, disgusted by them. You loathe them as you would a snake or a toad. Yet you are indignant at their wrongs. You would not have them abused. She doesn't want to see anybody abused, which is good. I mean, I don't like snakes. I don't want to see them abused either, So, but you don't want to have anything to do with them yourselves. So she has no real interest in Uncle Tom as a person or as a fellow human creature. She doesn't want to see anybody or any creatures of God's abused and mistreated, but she doesn't want to talk to Uncle Tom. She doesn't think it's nice to have Eva talking to him. So she has kind of an interesting perspective, and I think Harriet Beecher Stowe was trying to call that out, that it's funny to be so upright, self-righteous about you're treating them as slaves, which was obviously horrible. But at the same time, she doesn't want anything to do with him. She doesn't really look at him as an equal person. She just has her opinions about slavery, and that's kind of as far as she wants to go with it. You would send them to Africa, out of your sight and smell. And then send a missionary or two to do up all the self-denial of elevating them compendiously. Isn't that it? And that was Augustine St. Clair saying that. So he was exposing a little bit of, I guess, kind of the hypocrisy. She's saying it's because of the love of Christ that she's opposed to slavery, but the love of Christ stops with the person. She doesn't want to love Uncle Tom. She just wants to send him back to his country and then be done with it. So it's kind of an interesting thing. All right, chapter 17 changes the scene completely. This is back with George and Eliza. As they're running away, they're staying with the Quaker family. And there's a new character named Phineas Fletcher. I'll go ahead and tell you, he's not a major character, but he's important here. He's tall, red hair, and another thing about him is he's alert, and that was very important. Phineas had recently been at a little lone tavern and slept with one ear open. Actually, it says he slept with both ears closed, but he kind of woke up and then he heard something, so that's kind of funny. When he realized what they were talking about, he did wake up completely. What had Phineas overheard in the tavern? So he overheard, remember our friend Tom Loker. Now, he didn't know who Tom Loker was, but that's who it was. Tom Loker's group planning to capture George and Eliza and, of course, Harry, their son. And then there was also another slave and his mother with them, but I won't write those down. So he heard them talking about that. They were going to take George back to his master, where I'm sure he would be absolutely abused, probably to death. So it was like a death sentence. They were going to take Eliza and sell her, because I guess they didn't feel like they had to return her because the Shelbys hadn't sent them to, the Shelbys weren't paying them to bring back Eliza. So they were going to sell her. And Harry was the one that, oh gosh, what was his name? Mr. Haley had bought. So they were going to return Harry to him. Okay. So fortunately, he was alert. He heard this plan, and he knew where they were. So had Phineas always been a Quaker? No. What made him become one? He married a Quakeress, Quaker woman. Why do you think the Quakers, especially Phineas, was willing to go to such a risk to help George, Eliza, Harry, Jim, and his old mother? So those were the other two slaves that aren't a huge part of the story. They do mention at one point they were bound by conscience. So I think they felt like God had put them in this place. They were able to help, and they couldn't turn away somebody. And you know, you might remember from an earlier chapter, Mrs. Bird and her husband, the senator, that even though he had voted for a law that said you can't help slaves, he wound up helping Eliza. So I think there's a level of conscience where people just can't turn away somebody in need when they realize it really was a life or death situation. Michael, I don't remember who Michael is, so let's hope it's not too important. Michael also helped escape and rode ahead to warn Phineas and the group that the pursuers were hot on their trail. So I do remember that. They went ahead, and Michael kind of stayed behind to see if they came, and then he could ride his horse very quickly to alert them, and he did. Why did Phineas have the group go into the rocks? It was a safe, well, let's not say safe. That might be stretching things. It was a good place to defend themselves. Because this is kind of answering this next question, and you don't have to write all this down, but it was like there was a place in the rocks where there was just a narrow entrance, and so you had to go through one by one, and they all went through one by one, and then they kind of jumped to another ledge, and they knew that the people pursuing them would have to come through that little space one by one, and when they did that, they could shoot them if they wanted to. So it kind of was a good place a defense position. George steps forward and bravely admits his identity boldly, along with a defense or a declaration of independence. Can you describe the scene that happened next? So, you know, he declares himself free, and then Marks was Tom Loker's partner. Marks shoots and misses. He tried to shoot George. Tom climbs up and gets shot. And, you know, the wonderful little Quaker man, "You're not welcome here," and shoves him off the rock down into the crevice, and shoved off the rock. So that's kind of what happened. I was going to just turn real quickly to, I really did enjoy the scene. I mean, it's just amazing. They're hunting him down like a dog, like he's a runaway dog, you know. And then he says, "I'm George Harris. A Mr. Harris of Kentucky did call me his property, but now I'm a free man standing on God's free soil, and my wife and my children I claim as mine. Jim and his mother are here. We have arms to defend ourselves, and we mean to do it. You can come up if you like, but the first one of you that comes up within range of our bullets is a dead man, and the next, and so on till the last." And then, "I know very well that you've got the law on your side and the power," said George bitterly. You mean to take my wife to sell in New Orleans and put my boy like a calf in a trader's pen and said Jim's old mother to the brute that whipped and abused her before because he couldn't abuse her son? You want to send Jim and me back to be whipped and tortured and ground down under the heels of them that you call masters, and your laws will bear you out in it. More shame for you and them, but you haven't got us. We don't own your laws. We don't own your country. We stand here as free under God's sky as you are, and by the great God that made us, we'll fight for our liberty till we die. So he's just declaring himself to be a man, and I mean it's so obvious that he shouldn't be treated like a piece of property because he's a free person. And she's trying to bring that out. So I did enjoy that scene. Marks did not go up to the rocks. What did he do instead? What did all of the men do with Marks? Oh, what did all of the men with Marks and Tom Loker do? So they all left Tom. I mean, I don't think they thought he was dead, but they knew if they tried to help him, they'd get hurt probably, so they just left. And he could just die, I guess, as far as they were concerned. We see a picture of true grace for their pursuer. Eliza immediately feels pity for the injured Tom Loker, saying she hoped he wasn't killed because then that would come the judgment. George says that he would have regretted it if Tom had died. The old mother of Jim holds Tom Loker's head in her lap so he can get rest in the wagon. So these people that Tom Loker is treating like dogs and very disparaging toward, they actually wind up saving him. They took him back to the Quaker home to be cared for. The party goes to, well, I guess it's a different house, and Mariah's house, and who is named as the most amazing nurse. Her name was Dorcas. There was a Dorcas in the Bible. We should look that up. All right, so that is just a review. I know we've been gone so long, and you know, sometimes these chapters can be a little confusing, but I do want you to have these filled out. And then Thursday and Friday, you'll be reading chapter 18. It's kind of a long one too, so I'll give you 2 days on that. All right. Bye-bye.